Hello there. Welcome to the Saroid channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you. And go and get yourself something lovely to drink, because we're on part 3 of our story tonight. And it's a very exciting story indeed, because Miranda has left home and she was living under her mum's indomitable thumb. Her mother was a very, very draconian, very demanding woman who liked to control people's lives. And finally she's managed to escape, but she's moved to a small town where she's about to live opposite a haunted house. So let's see where we go to from here. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with part 3 of our story tonight. I hasten to say, when I did manage to leave my bereft mother behind, along with the life I'd lived in Atlanta for over 25 years, I felt both excited and exhilarated, more so than I'd done for a very long time, for I knew that this would be a brand new beginning for me, and getting away from home was far more liberating for me than it probably would be for other young people of my age who had likely not been subjected to the influences of a very dominating mother. To all intents and purposes, on this intrepid exploratory road trip of mine, I chose to investigate the quaint little rural town that I'd actively researched online at great length. For some reason I was inexplicably drawn to this place, as something about the enchanting historic old world town, with its small friendly populace, really appealed to me. The moment I arrived here, I just knew unequivocally that this was where I'd like to lay down roots, although I noticed that the houses in the street I really liked were very steep in price. Even though all these years later, now that I look back, I can honestly say I don't know why I was so serendipitously drawn to this town, but I'm inclined to believe that sometimes a place chooses you, rather than you choose a place, although as the buyer of a place, you ultimately would dismiss this way of thinking out of hand. But something had definitely propelled me to buy the house I chose to live in, and of course to live in this beautiful but very unusual town. One of the first things I fully appreciated about this delightful small town was how peaceful and agreeably slow-paced the lifestyle was, compared to the bustling, boomy vibe of a metropolis such as Atlanta, where adrenaline fuels the heartbeat of the city, so that everybody ultimately rushes around on a roller coaster ride from dawn to dusk, rather like a hamster on its wheel. The vibrant countryside swaddled the town on every side, so that the wild animals that lived in these parts became part of the scenery, and it really wasn't uncommon to see deer hanging around on the sides of the roads, seemingly unafraid of the human inhabitants of this small town. As a person who naturally gravitates towards the great outdoors and loves riding a mountain bike, nothing could be better than exploring the scenery around here, where there were so many exciting walking trails on offer. All these heartwarming things made me feel that at long last I had arrived at my forever home. Unlike other young people my age, who invariably leave their small towns to seek out the exciting opportunities a booming metropolis might obviously inspire, I was doing things the other way around, and running away from the thriving heartbeat of a big city to a much more gentler pace of life, where you could be forgiven for getting up a little later in the morning, or taking your time to enjoy a delicious lunch, without being rudely dictated to by the hands of a clock. Maybe my life had been so oppressed up to now, living under my mother's formidable thumb, so living in a big metropolis like Atlanta would not be much different. So escaping to the countryside was the best thing I ever did. I think many locals were naturally surprised to see a young person such as myself moving into their small-town rural neighbourhood, a woman who had willfully chosen to abandon the sophisticated allure of a charismatic city, if you can call it that, with its fancy wine bars and effervescent nightlife. But I was happy to give all that a miss, for in my mind's eye I was certainly gaining and not losing at all. There were only 2 decent-sized houses in a price range that I could actually afford, situated on one of the town's most historic streets. Both these houses for sale overlooked each other. When I began my ambitious house-hunting expedition, I hasten to say there were other places in this small town I could more easily afford, but such places were so tiny, there was hardly enough space in them to swing a cat, and they held little allure for me, for most of these small houses were pretty nondescript and rather unexciting. The two more substantially sized houses that I was looking for on this highly desirable, sought-after street where I really wanted to live were miraculously against all the odds within my budget, and were both extravagantly swathed in a rich flamboyant history going all the way back to the Victorian times. One of the houses I was due to be shortly shown around by an estate agent was called the Shannon House. The other house that was for sale happened to overlook the Shannon House. I do recall when I drove up to both houses with their for sale signs pitched in front of them, both on opposite sides of the street. I took one look at the Shannon House and physically squirmed. Much like the rest of the houses in the street, the Shannon House was distinctly Victorian. It had a steep pitched gable roof and was much more sizable than the rest of the houses in the street. It was framed in the furthest distance by a rambling woodland oasis of tall lofty trees that stretched back for quite a distance, with trails that were open for hikers to use. The Shannon House had spiky-looking turrets, a broad wrap-around porch, and a grey stone facade. But it looked so miserably austere, so ominously uninviting, so much so that it sent a nasty prickle down my spine. I observed wild burgeoning vines and creepers growing up the grey stone walls, while the bay windows of the sizable 3-story house stared back at me vacuously, rather like the empty, soulless sockets of a dead man's skull. The house would likely have been a desirable property back in its time, for it appeared structurally sound. It would not have been nearly so bad if it wasn't for the awful tenebrific energy the house so obviously exuded, that made it so sinister. Indeed, the hostile house reminded me of a grieving widow, wearing sackcloth and ashes, whose husband had gone off on a long voyage out to sea and had never returned home, so the woman indulged in her grief, refusing to ever wear colour again, or even put a smile on her face, as such was her lugubrious melancholia. When I looked at the Shannon House, my bones practically rattled inside me, like that of an old woman. I will say this, I have never known a house to have such a powerful effect on me, but the reaction I had to the Shannon House was so incredibly profound. It really was like being suddenly stung by a bee and having an allergic reaction. So in that quintessential moment, I knew I would not set foot in the Shannon House, not even for a quick appraisal with the estate agent, for the place absolutely repelled me. The estate agent responsible for showing me around both properties was a very agreeable, gentle-natured young woman called Pamela Freeman. She was a far cry from the money-grubbing estate agents in my part of the world, who are practically drooling to get a house off their hands so that their commission checks can come rolling in, like the seasonal rain every year. On seeing me arrive in my gold-coloured SUV, that I'd parked opposite the Shannon House, Pamela Freeman jumped out of her car and waved at me enthusiastically. She possessed that friendly small-town charm I found very endearing and immediately put me at ease. She was dressed in a blue and red outfit that made her look rather like an air hostess, especially as her long brown hair was pinned back in a neat little bun, and she was reasonably tall. Seconds later, the tall, lanky brunette was tapping on my window, which I pulled down to greet her with a warm smile on my face. "Hello, you must be Miranda Hoffman," she said to me, leaning in to look at me through the window. "That's right," I said, climbing out of my car and shaking the woman's hand. "My name is Pamela Freeman," she said to me, "but please call me Pam. Everybody does around here. I understand you're interested in laying down roots in our small town. And the house I'm showing you, well, both the houses I'm showing you around today are both within your budget. And this is the town's most famous street, for all the houses around here are Victorian and are steeped in a rich history, and very well preserved, I have to say. Everybody has maintained the houses on this street extremely well. I understand you spoke to my colleague Dennis Fairweather on the phone a couple of days ago, expressing a very keen interest in buying a house on this street. Is that right?" "That's right," I said. "He did tell me you'd be showing me around the place, but he said that most of the houses on the street were well over my budget, with of course the exception of the two you're planning to show me around today." I said rather cautiously. Good then, we're both on the same page. My colleague was telling you that this is the most famous street in our small town, and he's right about that. He's also right that the two properties I'm going to show you today are very affordable because the prices have been slashed significantly. Other houses on this street are very expensive, I'm afraid. But these ones that I'm going to show you around today are within your price range. Both of them are for sale. I'll be perfectly straight with you, Miss Hoffman. The Shannon house over there, the house with the grey stone walls and the large bay windows. What about it? I asked. Pamela Freeman pulled in a deep breath and straightened her back quite substantially, so she appeared even taller than she really was. Well, it's got a bit of a reputation, I'm afraid, if you know what I mean, she said rather coyly. No, what do you mean? I asked. Pamela Freeman dropped her voice to a muted whisper, almost as if she was afraid that someone was listening in to our conversation. Well, some people say it's haunted, but she chuckled. I don't believe in such things for a single second. I've never actually been the superstitious type. But here in a small town such as this, let's just say many of the folk around here are exceedingly superstitious, and so stories can get a tad out of hand, if you know what I mean, and probably become insanely exaggerated. I do, however, assure you, Miss Hoffman, the Shannon house is structurally sound. It's a very well-built Victorian home, if not a little bit menacing on the outside, and that tends to intimidate some folk. But my bet is that if time, money and energy is invested in the property, it could easily lose its gloomy appearance and actually become a much sought-after property on this street. Why do people around here believe it's haunted? I asked. Is it because it looks as if it belongs on America's most haunted website? I teased. Let's just say the moment I saw the house, it gave me quite the chills. Really, said Pam, raising a very arched, perfectly manicured brow. It's interesting you should say that. You're not alone in feeling this way. A lot of people experience similar feelings to yours when they lay their eyes on the Shannon house for the very first time. People tend to react to the house in different ways. Some love it. Others say the house actually makes their blood go as cold as ice. Many feel as if they're being watched. When it was last put up for sale, I cannot tell you how many viewers just got into their cars and drove off, refusing even to look around the house, because they felt it was so foreboding and they believed something terrible had happened there. And are they right? I asked. Did something terrible happen? In the house, I mean. I'm afraid the Shannon house is steeped in a rather depressing history, said Pamela, and not a good one at that, I'm afraid. I so wish I could say differently. If I could, the place would sell for a fortune, let me tell you. When you say depressing history, what do you mean by that? I asked. Well, some people believe that houses carry energy signatures, don't they? And if something traumatic happened in a home, the house will naturally absorb that energy. People are sensitive to immediately tuning into that kind of thing, if you know what I mean. So something traumatic did happen in the Shannon house? I asked. Well, it's a long story, but every local that lives in town is extremely well versed on the house's history. You can't live in this town and not know about the Shannon house. Furthermore, many of the locals are convinced it's the ghost of Darcy Shannon that roams the house at the dead of night, and that she is solely responsible for kicking out any new homeowners shortly after they move in, for nobody stays at the Shannon house for longer than about 6 months before they up and leave, always very suddenly. Really? That's intriguing, I said. Pamela nodded. Let's just say some people in these parts swear they've seen the ghost of Darcy in the windows of the Shannon house, staring out onto the street when the house is not occupied. But I've always taken such fanciful allegations with a pinch of salt, so to speak. I will only believe in something if I see it for myself. But I've been showing people around the Shannon house for over 5 years now, and never once have I experienced something paranormal on the property. By all accounts, small towns such as this are notorious for their ghost stories, aren't they? But folk around here are resolutely convinced that the Shannon house is definitely haunted. They believe by the angry female ghost of Darcy Shannon herself. So what did happen at the Shannon house? I asked, my curiosity almost certainly getting the better of me. I suppose I shouldn't ask you, because I have no intention of buying the place or even looking around it, but I am intrigued. You're not alone. Everybody's intrigued and curious about the Shannon house. I might as well tell you the story, said Pamela, shrugging her shoulders rather nonchalantly. If you don't hear it from me, someone else in town will tell you it. I'm in no doubt of that. In the 1800s, a woman by the name of Darcy Shannon, who was mentally unstable, lived in the Shannon house with her husband Abraham. The doctors believe she belonged in a mental asylum. She was delusional and had all kinds of mental conditions, like schizophrenia and God knows what else. Well, that's what it's alleged anyway. She'd become extremely manic from time to time, and when she became unhinged, she'd start self-harming herself by slashing her wrists on several occasions, and very nearly succeeded in killing herself, I have to say. Darcy's husband, Abraham Shannon, was naturally very worried about institutionalizing his beloved wife, because he was very much in love with her, and when he'd married her she had been of sound mind. It was only months after the wedding that she suddenly became completely wacko. It wasn't uncommon back in the day when people were displaying mental abnormalities for such people to be institutionalized in some kind of mental asylum. Really? I said. I had no idea about that. I'm afraid so. It was commonplace back then, Pam admitted. Abraham worried profusely about what being institutionalized would mean for his wife Darcy. He had seen firsthand how abysmally people were treated in insane asylums by the staff that worked there. He didn't want his wife to experience such cruel treatment in the hands of these healthcare providers, who were very abusive towards their patients and treated them with abysmal disdain. Sometimes the nursing staff would leave patients soaked in their own feces and urine, so it was hardly sanitary, and if patients got out of hand, they'd be locked away in the dungeons beneath the building for days at a time. Darcy's devoted husband decided to keep his wife in a locked bedroom upstairs, rather than trust the healthcare providers in the sanatorium to look after her. He'd put a chain on her feet during the day, so she would not be able to harm herself, as she couldn't escape the confines of her bedroom, or get her hands on anything sharp that she could use on herself. You may think what he did was cruel, but it was a whole lot better than anything she might have experienced in a mental asylum, where they willfully ignored the needs of their patients most of the time. It was said that Darcy was enraged by her husband treating her like a caged animal, but what she failed to appreciate was that everything he was doing was out of his love for her and his need to protect her. People would walk down this street and hear her shrieking and screaming at the top of her lungs. It caused many of the locals living here much disquiet. So many of them begged Abraham Shannon to send his wife to a mental asylum, for she was disrupting the peace in this tranquil street. Sometimes at night her screams could be heard for miles around. They said she sounded like a rabid wild animal. Of course Abraham Shannon refused to listen to their well-meaning advice. He rarely believed he could take care of his wife adequately himself. I immediately cupped my hands over my mouth in horror. That's dreadful! To be locked up all day with a chain on your foot. I can't imagine what that must have been like for the poor woman. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please go on. This is one hell of a story. It sure is, Pamela agreed. Well, one day Darcy managed to get free from her husband's chains. No one knows exactly how she managed to do this. Finally, he came into the bedroom one night to bring her her evening meal. Her dinner was on a tray. She knocked it out of his hands so that it all went flying around the room, and the china plates broke. Darcy became frenziedly manic. She aggressively pounced on her husband Abraham. Rather like an untamed wild animal, she held him down and beat him up with her fists. When she became like this, some say she was as strong as an ox. She then threw her husband out of her bedroom window from the 3rd floor, which was a substantial drop. His head hit the stone slab below, so he died on impact. Moments later, Darcy, who had become as manic as a wild animal, and was quite literally foaming at the mouth, and roaming the house at will. It was in the kitchen she found a sharp knife in a drawer, and used it to slash her wrists, and with her own blood she wrote all over the walls in the house, in a language that was later verified to be Latin. The words "necer" were written on the wall, and that means kill. There was another word that sounds like mori or something like that, which means die. It was all dreadfully sinister, I gather. When they recovered her body, there was blood smears all over everything, On the walls, on the parquet flooring, on the staircase. The police at the time, when they witnessed the scene, they'd never seen anything so macabre in their lives. They were in no doubt that Darcy had been deranged, and when they found her on the scene she had bled out. She was lying dead in a pool of her own blood. It was very clear that Darcy's husband, Abraham Shannon, was not equipped to look after someone as mentally unsound and as unbalanced as Darcy was. Some people were absolutely convinced the woman was demon-possessed, given the Latin writing that was found on the walls of the house, as Darcy didn't even know how to speak Latin. "Good God!" I said, staring at Pam confounded. "That is an extraordinary story. It sounds to me as if Darcy needed an exorcist rather than a mental asylum. No wonder the house looks so melancholic." "Do you tell any potential buyers to the Shannon house all this?" I asked curiously. "It's just with this kind of sales pitch. No one would ever want to buy the place, surely. I know if I'd initially been keen to buy the Shannon house based on its intriguing history, I wouldn't after you told me all this. In truth, I'd run a mile." "Well, it feels right to tell people the truth," said Pam. "You have to have integrity when it comes to selling a house. If you don't, it can backfire on you. Besides, if anything bad were to happen to someone who purchased the Shannon house from me, I'd have to live with the guilt, wouldn't I? Because I would know that I'd sold them a house without due warning. I always believe in frankly laying my cards on the table and telling people the God's honest truth, even if it's not what they want to hear. Let's just say the Shannon place has a rather beleaguered history. People deserve to know the truth about it. I always believe in telling people the truth." "Don't you agree?" she asked me. "Of course I agree," I said. "But I wish other estate agents were as honest as you. But are you telling me, even after you warn people about the Shannon house, that there are people out there that actually buy the place?" "But of course there are people out there eager to buy the place. You'll be surprised. There's so many types of people in this world. You learn that pretty quickly when you become an estate agent. There are many people that I've warned about buying the Shannon house, but they're eager to buy it and they refuse to listen to my warnings. Let's just say when it does go on the market, we often have the for sale sign outside the house, sometimes for months at a time, and then suddenly someone will come to the house and insist on buying it. It's almost as if the Shannon house itself has chosen them rather than the other way around, because the house seems to have some kind of hold over them. I will tell them the sordid history about the place, and they simply don't care about it. They say they're not superstitious. They absolutely don't believe in ghosts. They want to move in right away. But alas, they never last long in the house. None of these people ever tell me what happened to them, or why they just up and left the place. Well, most of them don't. They tend to be very guarded about the matter if I ask any inquiring questions about why they suddenly want to sell. I will come into the office one day and receive a phone call, and I'll find that they've moved away, and they usually left the Shannon house in the middle of the night, and they asked me to put the property up for sale. Some of them organise a removal company to pick up all their things. They don't even want to step back into the house, which suggests something gave them one hell of a scare. It certainly sounds like it, I agreed. I've never believed in ghosts and things like that before. But when people abandon their house in the middle of the night, without ever looking back, and getting some other organisation to pack away all their worldly things, well, it certainly gives you pause for thought, don't you think? Absolutely. You echo my sentiments, said Pam, and the sentiments of many of the locals living around here. If you speak to the folk around here, many of them will tell you that they believe the ghost of Darcy Shannon has a manic episode once every 6 months, like she did in life, and that's when she throws the current owners of the Shannon house out. That's what they believe is going on, but it's all speculation. It's interesting to note that none of the people that have purchased the Shannon house have ever been local. Really? I said. That is curious. You'd think that more of the locals would do anything to live on the town's most revered street. Not really, said Pamela. People around here would never touch the Shannon house with a barge pole. But to outsiders, some of them think the Shannon house is absolutely delightful. They'll see it online and are drawn to it for some reason. The previous buyer, for example, saw the house online and called me up at once about the house, saying she just had to have it. I said to her, "Ma'am, you haven't even seen the Shannon house yet." But she didn't care about that. I informed her all about the bleak history, but that didn't bother her in the slightest, and shortly afterwards she and her family had moved in. But 6 months later they were all but gone, and were not remotely forthcoming as to why they'd suddenly left in the middle of the night. When I asked the woman directly why she'd upped and left in the middle of the night, I asked her what had happened and why she wanted to sell. She was very brusque with me and said, in a very cool tone of voice, "It's none of your business." So that was me well and truly put in my place, let me tell you. It goes without saying that I won't want you to show me around the Shannon house, I told Pam, because I'd never buy a place like that. But I might as well see the house opposite. The house opposite is absolutely charming, Pamela assured me. She raised a hand as if to stop me from talking. I know what you're going to say, Miss Hoffman. I raised a brow. What am I going to say? Well, I'm guessing because the house opposite overlooks the Shannon house, you wouldn't want to buy it. Am I right? I was rather thinking that. You took the words out of my head, I admitted soberly. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm very attracted to the price of the house, and the fact that it's situated on the town's most historic, alluring street. The house itself is absolutely gorgeous, I can see from the outside. But I have to ask myself whether I'm happy of overlooking such a menacing view. When I look at the Shannon house, well, it makes my skin crawl. I understand where you're coming from in this, Miss Hoffman, but I urge you to see the bigger picture. I'm going to be absolutely straight with you. For the kind of money you want to spend on a house in this town, and your limited budget, you're not going to get very much for the price that you're offering. You're going to need a whole lot more money, especially if you want to buy a house of this quality. And you could never afford to buy a house on this historic street unless the price was significantly slashed. The only reason such an awesome-looking property is going for such a steal is simply because it overlooks the Shannon house. People don't want to buy properties that overlook haunted locations or cemeteries. The way I see it, Miss Hoffman, is you've got for yourself a sound investment. Hand on heart, I'd buy this house myself if I had the funds to do so. And who knows, one of these days someone will likely renovate the Shannon house, or even throw a wrecking ball at it. And so your view will be a whole lot less menacing, and you'll be able to know that you got this place for a real deal. So you think it's a great investment for me to buy this place? I asked. Well, I haven't shown you around it yet, have I? But I assure you it is utterly charming, even better on the inside than on the outside. You can see it's a Victorian double-storey home, much smaller in contrast to the Shannon house, of course, but sizable enough. And there are 4 bedrooms in this house, and 3 bathrooms. And yes, to answer your question, I absolutely believe it's a good investment. If you absolutely abhor overlooking the Shannon house, word of advice, just keep your living room curtain permanently drawn, like the previous owner obviously did. But put it this way, for the same amount of money, the other houses around here that I can show you, they are very small by contrast. Nor are they situated in such an illustrious street such as this. This delightful Victorian house I'm showing you around today boasts incredible unique features, rather like the original parquet flooring, which is in stunning condition, as you can see. You may also observe that the owners have replaced the old wallpaper with a Dassac-style wallpaper, which I believe is practically identical to the original wallpaper, although it's not nearly so dark, so it brightens the house up considerably in this lighter shade. There are some original ornate chandeliers in this house that have been here since the house was first built, that you won't find in a modern home. Everything is in excellent condition, and the highly decorated tiled floor in the entrance hall is extremely elaborate. The previous owners ensured that the maintenance of this utterly delightful Victorian home was kept up to scratch, and you'll be glad to know that the kitchen has been recently renovated, and all the lavish curtains that adorn the bay windows are in keeping with the style of the property. When Pam showed me around the Victorian house that was soon to become my home, and I saw how spaciously cosy it was, I realized what a great deal I was getting, and I knew absolutely that I would be looking a gift horse in the mouth if I foolishly walked away. So I snapped up the house at once, and soon settled down into my home like a duck to water. I was fortunate to be able to furnish the house at a steal, for an old lady had died in town, and the auction that I was able to attend provided me with all the much-needed furnishing, that I would require for my home. It goes without saying my mother badgered me every single day to come back home, with her nagging phone calls that never ever seemed to abate. It was rather like having a fly buzzing in my ear a couple of times a day. But I put up with my mother's phone calls, with gritted teeth, as I knew if I ignored her, the next thing I would find was she'd be at my doorstep, demanding to know why I'd refused to answer her phone calls. "It's not the same, love, without you around. It really isn't. We miss you so dreadfully," she complained. "The place is so soulless without you. Please reconsider coming back home, love. We rarely need you around the place." In the next breath my mother would rant and say, "It's so selfish of you to up and leave us so abruptly, Miranda." "I'll have you know, Miranda, I'm not feeling dreadfully well these days. I'm getting these mysterious throbbing migraine headaches. They just won't stop. I guess it's all brought on by the dreadful stress of your not being around. The doctor certainly seems to think so." I knew my mother was throwing out all the bait she possibly could, in order to drag me back home, but I was not going to bite. In truth, I felt free for the very first time in my entire life, and when a bird is released from the confines of its cage, it ain't going to go back to its previous prison in a hurry. I had created for myself a cosy home. I had made friends in town, and on top of it all my business was going remarkably well, and better than it had ever done so before. Granny Violet had been absolutely right. She told me that I'd have the courage to find my feet in the world without my mother propping me up like a china doll on the settee, and she was right. I was beginning to find out who I was. My confidence was surging every day. I was even selling some of my creations to a local pet shop in town, and my doggy coats seemed to be selling like hotcakes with many of the locals and visitors alike. So I was making a good living for myself, and in my spare time I would take casual strolls down one of the woodland trails at the back of the Shannon house, and I really was beginning to enjoy my new life. One night, as I was drawing the curtains in the living room, I glanced out towards the Shannon house. Sometimes I did this so instinctively, before the wise little voice in my head warned me to please look away. But on this sober occasion I couldn't help myself, for I had to look, as my gaze lingered for longer than it probably should have done, and that was when, under the pearly effervescent light of a full moon, in a black tenebrific sky, dotted with a kaleidoscope of silvery stars, I observed the distinctive shadowy shape or silhouette of a woman on the 3rd floor of the Shannon house, when it was currently supposed to be unoccupied, as the for sale sign was resolutely still posted outside the front of the house. I stared at the woman, and for a while she stared back at me. I could feel her looking at me, her dark eyes drilling directly into mine, and in that harrowing moment my flesh physically crawled. I blinked for a brief second and thought, what the hell did I see just then? And when I looked up again at the window, the woman was all but gone, and I told myself that I'd all but imagined it. It was so much easier that way than to actually admit to myself that I'd seen something. I didn't want to believe, even for an idle second, that I might possibly have laid eyes on the ghost of Darcy Shannon. It was a couple of days later that the for sale sign was finally removed from outside the Shannon house, and a family of 4 moved into the property. I was to learn from the word around town that had spread like an untamed wildfire, that the couple called the Greenbergs, who had bought the Shannon house, had been utterly enchanted by the place, believing the Shannon house was a marvellous example of Victorian architecture at its very finest. Never mind the house actually looked like a mausoleum. It would seem the father worked from home, and decided, much like myself, that he wanted to lay down roots in this charming historic small town. The couple's 2 children, a girl and a boy, who looked to be between the ages of both 7 and 9, started to attend the local school, and I would regularly see them dressed up in their school uniforms, being escorted by their devoted mother to and from school, which was all but a 10-minute walk away. I was so stunned that the family would buy such a menacing-looking home, with such a dark history attached to it, without so much as batting an eyelash, Did they not see what I saw when I looked at the Shannon house? Obviously not. When I bumped into Pam, the estate agent in town, who was the woman who sold me my current property, I asked her about the Greenbergs, as I was naturally curious about the people who'd moved into the house opposite me. I was thankful that Pam was not reticent to talk about the new occupants of the Shannon house. She chuckled. I told you they're always those people that, for reasons unbeknown to me, fall head over heels in love with the Shannon house. And when Julia and her husband laid eyes on the house, they just had to have it. I understand they were both taken by the place. I gather the children hate the house with a passion, and who can blame the poor little mites for that? I believe they keep telling their mother that there's a woman watching them, wearing fancy clothes. Mrs. Greenberg doesn't believe a word of it. She says her children have heard from the friends at the local school all about the fact that they're living in a house that is reputed to being haunted by a ghost by the name of Darcy Shannon, and she thinks that her impressionable children are believing these fictitious allegations. Wow, it's interesting you say that the children say that, I said. In my experience, children don't make stuff like that up, even if their own friends have told them about the ghost of Darcy Shannon and the house's dubious history. Maybe the Shannon house is haunted after all. I've never believed in such things before, but I have to say living opposite the Shannon house has given me pause for thought. I've actually seen a woman standing in the third-floor window when the house was not supposed to be occupied. I persuaded myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but now I'm not so sure. Maybe I actually did see something. It's funny you should say that, said Pam. You're not alone in claiming to see a woman in the house from the third-floor window. The postman's made such claims himself. He said he saw a woman looking down at him on the third-floor window when he was delivering post to the house one day. Well, that was my experience, I admitted. Pam smiled at me warmly and said, My guess is that the Greenbergs won't last at the Shannon house very long. I'll give them 6 months at the most, and then they'll be gone. You mark my words. I've seen it all before. With that in mind, I curiously watched the new owners of the Shannon house carry on with their domesticated lives, like a regular family invariably would. If the truth be told, they seemed to be settling down just fine, and the man of the house, Mr. Greenberg, had improved the garden exponentially by mowing the lawn, trimming the hedges, and putting some pretty flowers in the beds. But days later the flowers had all but died, and when he replaced the beds with yet more seedlings, the same thing happened all over again. Mr. Greenberg looked like the kind of man that was well acquainted with attending to a garden, so it was more than a little paradoxical that his nimble fingers had not successfully succeeded in nurturing the flowers in his front yard. The Shannon house, in my opinion, remained as bodefully menacing as ever. I tried not to look at it, of course, but I was curious about the Greenberg family and how they were getting along, living in such a formidable, oppressive place. 7 months duly passed without incident, and I began to believe that Pam was wrong, and that the Greenberg family was actually going to stay indefinitely there for the foreseeable future, and this idea about the place actually being haunted was all but pie in the sky. One night I had a very dramatic, vivid dream. In my dream I saw a Victorian woman with a curtain of long dark hair, and eyes that were as black as a vulture staring at me, with a vicious, spiteful glare, almost as if she hated and abhorred the very sight of me. She was looking at me vengefully, like you might look at a cockroach you have accidentally squashed in your shoe. The woman was very elegantly attired in a beautiful blue-grey distinguished dress that boasted a full skirt and a tight-fitting bodice that accentuated her very narrow waist. The woman continued to glare at me with a furious indignance. Then she spoke and said, "Get the wretched Greenberg family to leave my house at once. I'll kick them out myself if you don't. I've had about as much of them as I can possibly take." I watched the crazed woman in my dream grab a sharp knife, which she waved around at me manically, wearing a deranged grin on her face. Then, to my absolute horror, I watched her slash her wrists. She began to laugh out loud. She looked down at the blood that was trickling out of the really deep gashes in her skin, that was hemorrhaging blood like I'd never seen before. I watched the woman use the blood from her wrist to write the words Abio with her fingers across the walls, which I was to later find meant leave, depart, or die in Latin. I've never known any Latin before, so the fact that this word came up in my dream was more than a little disturbing. I was so bewildered by this lucid dream that I woke up in a pool of my own sweat, the word abio ringing in my head like a clamorously loud church bell. I was gasping as I sat up to draw breath, wondering if this illusory dream was some kind of gruesome message delivered to me by a dead woman. In that moment I had a sudden overwhelming urge to look out of my bedroom window, to take a peek at the Shannon house, where I'd last seen the Victorian woman staring at me a while back. My heart was thundering violently in my chest as I quickly pulled back the heavy-weight velvety curtains and glanced out onto the street that was cast under a soft shower of moonlight. My eyes were quickly drawn to the third-floor window of the Shannon house. A little voice in my head was persuading me not to look, but I just couldn't help myself. It was as if a willful force beyond my control was supernaturally nagging me to do just that. And then there she was, staring right back at me. But I knew that I was staring at the ghost of Darcy Shannon. The moonlight lit up her features all too well. So now I was in no doubt that I was seeing the woman that I had vividly seen in my dreams, who had slashed her wrists and written the Latin words albio over the walls. The ghost of Darcy Shannon was there 1 minute and gone the next, like in a flash of light. And I remember when she vanished from my sight, I was shaking like a leaf. She had given me a message from beyond the grave, telling the Greenbergs to leave at once, or she'll deal with them. But how could I possibly go to the Greenbergs and tell them a ghostly woman in my dream had told them to leave their home? I couldn't possibly do that. Would they even believe a word of it, or heed the warning from a ghost? For 3 nights nothing happened at the Shannon house. Everything remained remarkably quiet in our street, almost unnaturally so, almost as if our street was waiting for a rude disruption to undermine its peace. One night I woke up with a start, as if someone had jolted me wide awake, and for reasons I cannot explain, I found myself dashing over to my bedroom window and quickly glancing out at the street towards the Shannon house. It was 12:10 at night. The street was cloaked in darkness, while the moon hid her shimmering face behind some cloud cover, but there was a light on in the Greenberg house, which was profoundly strange, as most people's houses were cast in the shadow of darkness at this time. I suddenly observed frantic activity coming from the Shannon house. The whole Greenberg family were dressed in pyjamas and appeared to be in quite the panic, based on the way they were rushing to their car in the middle of the night. The family quickly jumped into the car and drove away, speeding down our street at such a frantic pace, as if running away from a deadly predator. Finally the Greenberg family were gone. The street became quiet again. When I looked up at the third-floor window of the Shannon house, I could see the familiar silhouette of Darcy Shannon. For a moment she held my gaze, her eyes burning into mine. I could swear she smiled, but it was not a kind, friendly smile, but a vindictive, triumphant smile. I hasten to say the Greenbergs were never seen in our small town again, and I'd often wonder what had become of them, and what had made them leave at the dead of night in their pyjamas. What had scared them so much that they had abandoned the property in the middle of the night? Once again the for sale sign went up, and I was to find answers sooner than I thought I would, as I ran into Pam, the estate agent in our town, and what she told me about the Greenberg sudden exodus left my hair curling. "What's going on with the Shannon house?" I asked her. "I notice it's gone up for sale again. I saw the Greenbergs dashing out of the house in the middle of the night. They looked terrified. They were wearing pyjamas. They couldn't get away from the Shannon house fast enough. It was so troubling to witness, let me tell you." "You saw them leave?" Pam asked me, looking both bewildered and curious. "I'm afraid so. They looked terribly haunted. Something had petrified them half to death, for sure." Pam nodded. "Didn't I tell you the Greenbergs wouldn't last there for long? Mind you, they did pass the 6-month limit, which in itself is a record. I did warn them about the history of the Shannon house, but Mrs. Greenberg insisted on buying it. Well, both of them did, actually, and now they're selling. Nothing surprises me with the Shannon house. Nobody ever lasts there terribly long in my experience. It's a little like Groundhog Day being replayed over and over again, as far as that house is concerned." Did you happen to ask Mrs. Greenberg why she and her family left so suddenly in the middle of the night? Did she tell you what scared them so much, and why they want to sell the Shannon house all of a sudden? Well, as it happens, she did give me some answers. She wasn't as evasive as the other owners have been. You mean she spoke to you? She told you why she left in the middle of the night? I asked curiously. Pam nodded. I thought she'd be evasive, but no, she wasn't. She was very matter-of-fact, as it happens. She told me that the children had kept complaining about a very angry Victorian woman always sneering at them and deliberately hiding their toys around the house from them. Mrs. Greenberg found her son's skateboard in the oven, would you believe? And she kept finding the children's things in weird places that she couldn't explain. She was convinced that her kids were putting their toys in these places on purpose so that they could blame it on a non-existent ghost. She did say they were complaining tirelessly about being scared all the time. One day Mrs. Greenberg's daughter went into her bedroom. She found one of her dolls had been broken into pieces. Its arms were hanging on the curtains. A head was on the bedside table, and there was a lipstick scrawl on the bathroom mirror which read, "Leave." The girl was absolutely distraught and told her mother that the horrible Victorian lady was always watching them and had killed her doll, and left a horrible scrawl on the bathroom mirror. Mrs. Greenberg knew that her daughter would never break her doll into pieces, so that incident troubled her greatly, as did the mysterious scrawl in lipstick on the bathroom mirror. Both her children insisted on sharing a bedroom together, demanding that they slept with their lights on. Mrs. Greenberg continued to believe her children had been persuaded by the kids at school that they were living in a haunted house, and were so impressionable that even their minds were playing tricks on them, which of course was not true. It would seem the bizarre incident with her daughter's doll, though, continued to irk her. One day, as Mrs. Greenberg was fixing a cheese and pickle sandwich for her husband, who was working in the study at the time, she felt something tug at her hair very hard. She turned around and no one was there. She felt as if someone was watching her, and she claimed to experience a cold chill running down her spine. She thought she was going mad, and persuaded herself she had imagined the whole thing. One day she came home to find the word Abio scribbled all over the wall in her kitchen in red crayon. She was furious because her husband had only just painted the kitchen wall in a pretty yellow colour. Mrs. Greenberg was infuriated and dragged her children into the kitchen, asking them to explain themselves and why they had drawn all over the wall. But when she showed them the evidence of their so-called mischief, the writing had all but mysteriously vanished. Mrs. Greenberg began to think she was losing her mind, and was wondering if something was seriously wrong with her. On the evening when the family fled, Mr. and Mrs. Greenberg both woke up with a start one night, looking at each other in bemusement, because they heard a violent ear-piercing crashing sound coming from the kitchen. It was such a terrible noise. It was like dishes and plates being thrown across a kitchen floor and smashed into hundreds of pieces. It was so incredibly disturbing that Mr. Greenberg told his wife to lock herself in the bedroom with the two children, which she did at once. I think the couple believed that someone may have broken into the house. Mr. Greenberg, with a rifle in his hand, rushed into the kitchen, but there was no evidence of broken china anywhere. Everything was quiet. He investigated the entire house, and even the outside, and returned back into the house more than a little bemused. Mrs. Greenberg left her children in her bedroom, telling them she'd be back soon. She wanted to investigate what had become of her husband, and what was keeping him so long. She was about to go down the staircase when Mr. Greenberg entered the house. He was looking up at her, and making all this kind of sign language at her. She wondered what her husband was saying, because he kept pointing at the staircase. What he actually said was, "Behind you. She's behind you. Watch out." Mr. Greenberg observed an irate, manic-looking, very Victorian woman, wearing a silvery grey dress, standing directly behind his wife. She was laughing very menacingly, and then suddenly she pushed Mrs. Greenberg down the staircase. "Was Mrs. Greenberg all right?" I asked. "It would seem so," said Pam. Apparently Mr. Greenberg rushed towards his wife, intercepting her fall, and stopping her from tumbling to the very bottom of the staircase. He looked up and could see the ghostly woman staring down at him from on top of the staircase. She had a manic grin on her face, and he knew by one look at the ghostly apparition that she was not only insane, but seriously dangerous. He quickly gathered his family together, and they dashed to the car. They were all wearing pyjamas at the time, and they said the house smelt very strongly of a pungent woman's perfume, which the kids claimed to often smell when the ghostly apparition was around. Mr. Greenberg said the Victorian woman he had seen looked as real as you or me, but she was absolutely insane. He was afraid for the family's well-being, which is why they fled the Shannon house, genuinely fearing for their very lives, as they believed that the ghost of Darcy Shannon was what they had seen. "So do you believe what Mrs. Greenberg told you?" I asked Pamela. Pamela shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know what to think. I know emphatically that Mrs. Greenberg is not making this up. When I first met her and showed her around the Shannon house, and informed her how the locals believed the place was haunted, and I told her about the history of the place, she pooh-poohed such nonsensical ideas, saying she'd never heard anything so insane in all her life, and that there was no such things as ghosts. And now she appears to be singing an altogether different tune, and you don't do that unless you've seen something that has really rattled you." So there we are, that is the end of part 3 of our story. Part 4 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, good night and goodbye.